To Slate Political Gabfest, but this is our first interdenominational webcast featuring Rabbi Ami Hirsch, Rabbi Rachel Ain, and I'm Rabbi Jason Herman. Introduce myself, I'm the rabbi of the Hudson Yards Synagogue in Midtown Manhattan, and also the executive director of the International Rabbinic Fellowship. And I want to welcome all of you, and we'll have a bit more to say about what we are doing here, but I want to turn it first to Rabbi Ami Hirsch to introduce himself.
I'm the senior rabbi of the Stephen Weinsberg Synagogue. I've been here for 16 years. Before that, I was the executive director of ARTSA, which is the Reform Movements Association of Reform Zionists of America, and I've done that for 12 years. So it's good to be with my terrific colleagues and friends, and I'm looking forward to our dialogue.
And next to Rabbi Rachel Ain.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Rachel Ain. I'm the rabbi at Sutton Place Synagogue, which is a conservative synagogue on the east side of Manhattan. I'm in my 9th year here at the synagogue, following time I spent in upstate New York and Syracuse, as well as the director of the National Young Leadership Department at the Jewish Federations of North America. It is so great during this time to be sitting in dialogue with my friends and colleagues.
Thank you both. And again, as I've introduced myself, I'm Rabbi Jason Herman. I'm an Orthodox rabbi. And I want to just welcome you again to what we are, hopefully is going to be a very fruitful dialogue across the denominations at a very important point in our history, as well as our nation's history, given all that is going on in current events and all that is going on in the world. And to do that, I want to actually, say that really these type of things are in fact unique. We don't actually see that many occurrences of rabbis across all the different denominations who are engaged in very public dialogue. But Rabbi Hirsch, this is actually perhaps not something new to you. You've in fact written a book with that in a dialogue with an Orthodox rabbi 20 years ago, maybe now?
Close, yeah.
Years ago.
You were a lot younger.
So perhaps you can maybe just reflect for us a little on that experience and what's different, in 20 years to how we speak to each other.
Well, first of all, I did it, and I participate in as many of these Jewish dialogues as I can because I believe it. I believe it as a matter of philosophy and of Jewish values. I believe in Klal Yisrael, which means the unity of the totality of the Jewish people. I think it's important to have open channels of communication. We spent about 1.5 years writing this book. My colleague, Rabbi Reinman from Lakewood, is a Haredi rabbi, so it's not simply modern Orthodox, but that kind of thing basically is not generally done in that part of the Orthodox community for sure, which made it even more attractive to me. I should say that in the 18 months where we exchanged documents and emails and put this book together, and we discussed a broad gamut of really some of the major issues in Jewish life. I always felt that this thing actually wouldn't see the light of day. It was fascinating me to be able to participate in it, and just for that reason alone, I was happy to do it. But I was always skeptical that it would see the light of day because at ARTSA, at the Reform Movement Zionist arm in Israel, I had had a lot of experience working with the established Haredi community, and I knew their perspective on lots of things, including dialoguing with the Reform rabbis. And I kept on saying to my colleague, Rabbi Reinman, we're doing it for fun, we're doing it for interest, but this is not going to be published. He says, don't worry, I've got all the authorizations I need from inside the community. And it turns out it was published, and it was a very popular book, especially more than any other place in the ultra-Orthodox communities. And we got reports from booksellers that in fact it was selling the hottest in ultra-Orthodox zip codes, Haredi zip codes. Only there, booksellers used to report that they would put the books in paper bags so that nobody would see what books they were going out of the store with. In any
never
case,
knew that.
we were kind of both right because they actually put a harem on the book within a month of its publication in the Haredi community, validating what I thought, which is had they known, had the people in power who really counted, had they known that this book was being published and what was in the book, they never would have allowed it to be published. But it was published, fortunately. And it constituted, he was very proud of it, so was I. And more than anything else, it was 18 years ago, so my views have kind of mellowed a little bit. But more than anything else, I'm proud of the fact that we did it, that we wanted to do it. It's out there, it's on the record, and it reflects my view that Jews should be talking to each other.
Rabbi Ain, you also have quite a bit of interdenominational experience, as rare as we sometimes claim that this is. For our viewers, Rabbi Ain actually chairs the AJC Rabbinic Roundtable and has been involved in multiple other interdenominational efforts. So if I could ask you, what has been your experience, in leading that and bringing, multiple parts of conversation together, and where do you see the state of the world today on these conversations?
So it's a great question. When I think back to what gave me the strength and the interest in this, it goes back to when I was a child, that though I was steeped in the conservative movement by being a member of a conservative synagogue and going to Camp Ramah and USY, I also went to the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, which is a pluralistic, non-denominational Jewish day school in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. And I learned then, and I learned from the commitment of my mom, who was very involved in the Federation world, UJA Federation world in DC, that the entirety of the Jewish community needs to work together, both for issues relating to the Jewish community as well as issues relating to humanity. And that if we only do that in our own denominational lanes, we're going to miss the point. So by going to a day school where there were multiple minyanim, and the egalitarian traditional minyan that I went to was just as valid as the Orthodox, is just as valid as the Sephardi, is just as valid as the creative minyan, 25, 30 years ago, really had an impact on how I see what it means to have a rabbinic voice. And that has translated my whole career. So my involvement in, as Rabbi Herman, you said, the American Jewish Committee Rabbinic Roundtable, saying that there are certain core issues that regardless of denomination, we should be coming together and exploring. Or when I did the Rabbis Without Borders Fellowship at Klal, saying there are issues that we want to get out there into the public. How do we do that? That's not a denominational question. That's a Jewish question. That's a marketplace question. And it doesn't matter where we got our smicha. We want to come together to elevate our voices. And right now with coronavirus, I think we're seeing more than ever that sharing our resources is the idea that a rising tide lifts all ships. And we're seeing that amongst our colleagues. By working together, by sharing ideas, we're gaining so much more. So I am thrilled to be doing this. And I've always found there's two areas where I want to make sure I locate myself besides my denomination, which I'm very involved in. And that's interdenominational dialogue like this and interfaith dialogue with other religious leaders. And if you take interfaith, interdenominational, but then also be proud of who you are and what drives you, I think you're a much more solid rabbi.
Rabbi Herman, I'd actually like to ask you because, as I said before, there are fewer Orthodox rabbis who are prepared to do this and do it publicly and formally. What motivates you, and is there any kind of tension either in your community or in the Orthodox world, including the rabbinic world, in doing this in this kind of way?
Right, so thank you actually for throwing the question back at me. And answering it, actually, Rabbi Ain's comments reminded me of a saying that one of my favorite high school teachers used to say, which was actually based on a midrash that says, if I have $1 and you have $1, and we each give each other the $1, how much are we left with? We still have $1. But if I have an idea and you have an idea, and I share my idea with you and you share your idea with me, then we each have 2 ideas. And that I've always found that dialogue with people who are different, even similar, but some differences, that I always come out of such a conversation richer and with deeper understanding than I did before. And I was going to perhaps then throw the question, after that, given, how valuable I find it, why is it that it's so rare? So since Rabbi Hirsch asked me the question, perhaps I can, speak about it, from the, the Orthodox, perspective, because probably Orthodoxy has a good amount of the reason as to why it's been so rare in an interdenominational sense. But I think even though it's been rare throughout history and it's been Orthodox resistance to participation in this is why it's been rare, I think generally society in general is moving much more to siloing and people being, separate. So these kind of conversations are becoming rare, independent of our actually Orthodox resistance. And I would say that there was two things. Earlier in my career, I would say that there was still some resistance to interdenominational dialogue and interfaith dialogue. And I often term that as, fighting the last war. That, we in our denominations, the way we got to these denominations, we were engaged in a debate in the 19th century, as to how the Jewish community should react and respond to both the Enlightenment and the Emancipation. What it meant to no longer be in the shtetl and being free Jews. And that was a very important debate to have. And the consequences of that debate for the way in which people experienced and lived their Jewish lives were really stark. That in many ways there were people, whose entire sense of what it meant to be Jewish was uprooted almost overnight. And, the other denominations, whichever sense you were coming from, felt that either you were stifling people's Jewishness or you were actually robbing their Jewish experience. But I think particularly in the Orthodox world is that we failed to recognize that battle, that debate ended. And Rabbi Hirsch and I had a conversation for a bunch of Israelis back in January, and I said that, we have to recognize that in one sense, this whole debate about, whether or not religious decisions were an autonomous decision, rather, imposed by religious authority, that debate is over. Because living in a free country in America, we all get to make free, independent religious decisions. How one orients and in what system perhaps is a different conversation, but that debate has pretty much ended. But we have people who just, there's that story of the, Japanese soldier who was in the forest, was still fighting World War II 20 years after the surrender. And that, somehow happened that and I think part of it is because Orthodoxy is so steeped in tradition and we are very text-based. We had textual responsa talking about the early reforms. And we went and we learned that. And we understood that therefore there was something that was still problematic, but it didn't really mean that we were able to address contemporary challenges. But I think that explanation, which may have even been true only a decade and a half or 2 decades ago, is not the primary reason why I think these dialogues are rare and perhaps even becoming rarer. Is that politics, and particularly American secular politics, has actually taken over the religious debate. And that, particularly, within Orthodoxy, and the percentages are actually, not even that high, where, 60% of the Orthodox community is now Republican, whereas 80% of the Reform and conservative community has become Democrat, but actually, according to the Nishmat study, modern Orthodoxy is still more majority Democrat. It's actually the Haredi Orthodoxy that's driving, the shift to Republicans. And that in general society now, that you have it becoming your political affiliation drives the fact of who you associate with. That, decades ago, people would live in communities that were much more mixed politically. And now there's this stigma to marrying somebody of the other political persuasion. And people feel that they can't have conversations with people who are politically different. And I think perhaps the biggest reason, behind that is if you ask the question, a couple of decades ago, I don't remember, I've seen the data, I don't remember the numbers, but they would say, if you were asked a Democrat, Republicans were someone they disagree with. Now, actually, if you're a Democrat, Republicans are someone who actually pose a threat to the security of the democracy and well-being of the nation, and vice versa. If you're Republican, that's how you feel about Democrats. And when you have such people being such a threat on the political front, that makes the conversation, so much more difficult. So I really, thank you for the opportunity to give my view of the question. I'd like to, just ask you how that resonates, and perhaps, from your experience, because we all value from this, and we've said that this has been such an important part of all of our rabbinic careers, why we see this as, so rare and perhaps becoming rarer.
Look, I think that the three of us are coming at this being, from what I know of each of you, being proud centrists who are really trying to hold that middle. And unfortunately, I think in today's world, centrism has a bad name, and which is very, very sad. But I think that we need to think about what can we take, whether it's politically or religiously, from the different denominations, from the different approaches, from the different political parties, and say, what makes for an ideal, just, meaningful society? I don't believe anyone or everyone has all the answers. I think we're still striving for what is going to be better. And I don't think the answer that we're going to come up with is going to work for each of us. And that's okay. I do believe that we're at a point that there are certain non-negotiables. Rabbi Herman, I think you're right that the non-negotiable for me might be different than the non-negotiable for somebody else. The challenge is, when is that a political question? When is that a religious question? When is that an ethical question? When is that a values-based question? I don't think it's about partisanship. But we have to do what we can to learn and listen and sit together. It's why I actually am proud that my congregation is not monolithic. It would be easier if it were. Of course it would. I'd be able to, just say whatever I feel. But actually having an intellectually diverse congregation forces me to make sure what I'm saying, I'm not just shooting from the hip, but I really believe in it. So even if that means that I disagree with people in the community, again, be it religiously, politically, it's coming at a place from deep conviction. And I think that's what we're all trying to come together. I think also that in these kind of moments, when these dialogues are set up, you're showing people who have vast disagreement with one another, and the popularity is that people who are so different can come together and talk. I actually find what's exciting about this endeavor that the three of us are embarking on is you can have people who might see the details differently, but we're willing to say much of what we see the world as is exactly the same. And that's okay. And let's celebrate that, because too often we're caught up on how different everybody is. Let's figure out where there are areas of agreement, and then we'll get into the areas of disagreement.
Well, let me respond a couple of. First of all, I completely agree, Rabbi Ain, about trying to hold the center. Remember that Yeats poem, "The Center." And I think that's really important, and I think that, to the extent that I don't know if we all agree on all of the details, but to the extent that there's significant overlap on what we agree, I think our being together in and of itself, leaving aside whatever content we might agree on or have overlap, it is important. I think that the very idea is important. And it's a very distressing, troubling time. There is a certain not only polarization, but self-righteous polarization in the polls, which are growing, that are swamping what I still believe is the vast middle, and it's a very worrying phenomenon. I would also add that my understanding of Judaism and my understanding of the 35 years or so that I've been studying Judaism, the essence of Judaism from an intellectual perspective is to embrace a broad diversity of opinion and to argue it out. And so there was validation and justification in the disagreement. You couldn't actually you can't open a page of Talmud, you can't actually have a session of study without disagreement. So you had to find the disagreement. But, as the sages said, Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim sofa להתקיים. All controversies that are for the sake of heaven, which I always interpreted as for the sake of finding a greater truth, was destined to endure. So I believe that that's the heart of the Jewish intellectual tradition as well, and it overlaps with so much of the Western liberal intellectual tradition as well, which I'm very worried is preying on both sides, and especially on the left, which is something that I speak about all the time and challenge our people in our communities, since we are by and large liberal. I just want to go back to Jason Rabbi Herman, just the point that I think needs to be emphasized for everybody who's listening here, and you might want to expand on it by all means, which is it is very rare for an Orthodox rabbi to be willing to participate in this way. And the reason is not that they, not that they don't like non-Orthodox rabbis. And, it doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with a very specific expectation, which is grounded, like everything in Orthodoxy, in halachic reasoning, Jewish legal reasoning, that views non-Orthodox rabbis as having deviated from the path. And therefore, to get into a conversation with them, to share a platform with them, whether it's literal or virtual, is to bestow upon them a recognition and authority. And even to call them rabbi, which Rabbi Herman takes care to do, is itself rendered in the halachic world to be in violation of the expectations of the halachic standard. I'll end with this one really interesting point. We, in our book, it surprised me, but he actually agreed that we would both be listed in the same way, the same typeset. The only thing that he insisted that and he even gave me first billing because my name came first, alphabetically in my last name before his name. But the one thing he did insist on, which I was willing to agree, was he said, since I can't call you rabbi, none of us will be identified in the book as rabbi, and it will just be argued. So, Jason, Rabbi Herman, I grasp at every opportunity to engage in dialogue privately, but also, of course, publicly in the manner that we're doing, because that's the context of so much of the Orthodox world, and it leads to, no matter what feelings of friendship and camaraderie Orthodox rabbis might have with non-Orthodox rabbis, it leads to an inability to be able to manifest that publicly.
Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch. And I think this is actually sort of what I was getting at in my comments of fighting the last war. In the early years of these denominations, most of the average Jew on the street didn't know what reform meant and didn't know what conservative meant, conservative movement coming later. And if a well-known, respected rabbi, call them rabbi, they'll say, okay, that's a legitimate place to go. And a Orthodox kid in yeshiva, who didn't know any better, wants to know, can I go to this synagogue? Can I not? He said, well, does my rabbi allow that? And they felt that there was that need to kind of really delineate what was kosher, so to speak, or not. And I personally feel, and this is why it's never been an issue for me, is that's almost irrelevant. I don't think anybody in 2020 is looking to me to decide if they're going to go to your synagogue. And that somehow if I didn't call you rabbi, that suddenly means they're going to say, you know what, Rabbi Herman didn't call Rabbi Hirsch a rabbi, he must not really be a rabbi, so I'm not going to his synagogue, I'm only going to go to Rabbi Herman's synagogue, if that was the competition. That's just not the case. That's not how the world works today. I think maybe 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that probably really was true. But it's not anymore. And I think, if you want to go even further, now that we have the internet, this joke probably doesn't apply, but they actually there was a joke about 20, 30 years ago of which was the largest ordaining institution in the Jewish world. Either of you remember what this was? Very New York-centric joke. It said the 9X white pages. Because when these people, they were asked how they want to be listed in the phone book, said Rabbi so-and-so. And they were never actually had ordination. They wanted to be known as Rabbi, so the phone book listed them as Rabbi. And many people, for one reason or another, thought it was beneficial to be a rabbi, so the phone book listed them as Rabbi. And with that, if so many people were having the title, it didn't necessarily become such a problem. And I will tell you, even to the far right, the Haredi world, if it's not in public, they don't have a problem either. I've been in many settings where I've seen Haredi rabbis refer to Reform and conservative rabbis, by their title rabbi. They've addressed them. And I think perhaps maybe the other humorous way to do it, even Moshe Feinstein, who is the great halachic decisor in the Haredi world and the Orthodox world at large, used to write responsa, and he would refer to conservative former rabbis as rabbi in Hebrew letters, Resh Aleph Bet Yud Yud, as opposed to the Hebrew Rav. So in English, it suddenly became okay. We just won't use it in Hebrew. So everyone did their somersaults, and distinctions. But I think, again, the key point is we're in a world where no one really needs anybody else for their legitimacy. I don't grant you legitimacy. You don't grant me legitimacy. And if I'm not worried about that I'm granting someone legitimacy, that anyone's looking to me for who is legitimate and who's not, once that's off the table, then our conversation just becomes a productive conversation where we learn from each other and we share ideas. And I think we're, again, as I said before, richer as a result of it. So I want to come back to something you both were saying, about, where the three of us are coming from. And maybe just ask the question, I'll start with Rabbi Hirsch this time. How would you define, or what for you is a centrist or a moderate?
Oh, that's a good question. I suppose on the one hand, somebody who's a moderate is not extreme. And I suppose also it's a matter of temperament. One who is prepared to learn from all people, listen to all people. Remember the famous statement by Ben Zoma, who is wise? They who learn from all people. So I take that to be a moderate position. I think it's more a matter of temperament. Obviously, there are extreme intellectual perspectives, viewpoints, but from my perspective, it's in particular in the context of modern times, where there seems to be a intensification of cancel culture, by the way, not only on the left, but also on the right. I suppose it's somebody who is not that way, who wants to engage in dialogue, wants to find common ground, and understands that progress usually is not immediate, that progress takes time, month after month, year after year, generation after generation. In the American context, that we together try to build a more perfect union, knowing that there's work that it always needs to continue to be done. If you had given me a heads up on that, maybe I could have come up with a better.
No. I think that might be a question we might be coming back to probably multiple times in this series. I think it's an important one.
I think it's a great.
Let me ask Rabbi Ain, how would you define or describe what it means to be a moderate or a centrist?
I think it's somebody who can articulate what's important to them, but willingly admits they don't have all of the answers to figure out how to solve issues, whether it's issues of religiosity, issues of the state, being able to listen and hear deeply what's coming at us from those different sides, being able to understand what sounds like what is a soundbite response and what's a nuanced response, knowing when to say, I'm actually not sure, but I know what I'm hearing, I don't agree with. Again, wherever you are in a certain moment. I am sure that I don't have all the answers, but I know that there are things that I hear from the far left and the far right that I'm just not comfortable with, and I'm not willing to sit in those places. It's also the willingness and the need to bring in voices of those with whom I don't know if I agree or disagree, but I want to learn more. I'm thinking even just about the three of us, and as we're trying to build for our communities, meaning our individual communities and then the Jewish community, because we believe we have something to offer, that, you know, it's not just three men of different denominations, but, you know, you invited me to be one of the key respondents. I think that's important to show that we have that, but to also recognize that how we look at identity and how we look at markers of identity have been something that we need to explore even more deeply than we might have a few months ago. So what does it mean to have Caucasian rabbis, even of different genders? How do we bring in different voices, different experiences? I struggle with that. I struggle with, what does representation look like? I've struggled with that for the 16 years of being a rabbi. When I'm asked to do something, is it because I'm a woman or is it because I'm me? And if it's because I'm me, do I happen to be a woman? So I think about that as well when it comes to centrism, that we need to have representative voices of the community, but not in a way that then limits the voices of those people who have something to add, even if they look similar to other people who've already spoken. So I struggle with that. And I think about that when trying to create dialogue.
Thank you for that. I think maybe I'll share just a few, just my own reflections, I think it means to be a centrist and a moderate as well. I think for me, some of the important values is that a moderate is somebody who listens to an argument and sees the argument they're hearing on each side in the best possible light. It doesn't mean that you necessarily agree, with one side or the other. It doesn't mean that you always take the middle position down the road. It means you say, what is this person arguing from the right? What is this person arguing from the left? And what is the best possible spin I can put on it? That I'm trying to see that generally, my general approach to people is that they're coming to an argument with pure intentions, that their motivations, are the Shem Shamayim. Until there are people out there where that's not the case, but I think everyone gets the benefit of the doubt that they want to, live in a better world, a better country, a better city, and that, I think I would generally, my default position is that, people are coming to things with righteous intentions. I think a second, premise is that everything that somebody is saying has something about it that's, true, true to them, but then also, universally true but perhaps only in part. That they have some element, of the truth that they carry. And there's a famous mechilta about the giving of the Torah, as to why the Torah was given, publicly in Mount Sinai to 600,000 people. So the argument was that each person got, a different part of the Torah. In fact, actually, the Midrash actually says there were 600,000 letters in the Torah. It's actually counted, not 100% true, but it was a nice Midrash to say that, unless you have all of the individuals that are Mount Sinai together, you don't have the complete picture. And that's perhaps what we're doing here, as we're bringing something to it, that everybody, has something that they're saying, that is bringing a different perspective that's truth, to the arguments. And when I, listen to people, I try and figure out, what is the underlying value. And there's going to be some value that I share that's an important part, of that conversation. And I think lastly, I would, just add something that I think reflects on what Rabbi, Ain said, Often when we have these kind of conversations, people are focused on the difference. And when moderates, get into a conversation, we're often saying, this is where I disagree with the right, this is where I disagree with the left. And it's about, some type of disagreement. And it's like, and as soon as you say, this is where I disagree with the left, the right starts cheering. When you say, this is where the right is wrong, the left starts cheering. And you never really get to that moderate, balanced position. But I think rather maybe the best way for a moderate and a centrist to move forward is to articulate some positive vision that really incorporates the values that come from both sides. And I think, maybe the best way to do that is Rabbi Hirsch was getting, progressives, where it comes, it wants to see progress. We want to see the world move forward. There are things that the world is not perfect. We want to make the world a more perfect world. The conservative aspect is it's a long progression. It's an evolution, not a revolution. That we realize there's a wisdom that comes from the past. There's a wisdom to tradition that we want to conserve because that'll help us and that'll move forward. So we want to make progress by building on what came before, that we're part of a larger, narrative thing. Something to throw out there.
See, you guys are all really just conservative Jews. This is what it means. This is what it means to be a part of the conservative movement, Jewish movement, which has been criticized by so many, saying that we, don't stand for anything. We're either not this or not that. And I've always said that's actually not true. It's that there's an essence of both, an essence towards modernity and a lived tradition. I give Rabbi Steve Wernick credit for this story. When he was CEO of United Synagogue, he was telling a story about what it means to be a conservative Jew, and I think that it can apply in many ways of what we're talking about being centrist. He said that a member of his synagogue, when he was a rabbi, a woman had survived breast cancer, and in order to mark her going into remission and being clean of cancer, she wanted to do a haftarah on a Shabbat morning. And he said this was such a conservative movement moment because most likely in an Orthodox place, she wouldn't have been able to do it. And he wasn't sure would doing a full haftarah be a way a Reform Jew might mark the moment. And again, neither the Reform or Orthodox synagogues are doing anything inherently wrong, but it was a uniquely conservative movement moment where this woman wanted to mark engaging in tradition and in ritual on a Shabbat morning, but from a completely egalitarian perspective. And that has really struck with me. And I think that as centrists, what do we see as the positives in the world in which we live? Now, I do think the political world in which we live has shifted a lot. I think for many prior elections before 2016, certainly, what was vastly different between a Republican nominee and a Democratic nominee, there were sincere policy differences, but people could have an appreciation for both, even if they really wanted their person to win. I think we have seen a tremendous shift in how people view politics, and that's actually, I think, sad, but I do think for people who are farther to the left or farther to the right, I think they appreciate it more. And I think we need to name that. They're glad that many people have more of a progressive or more conservative. But I do think about that a lot.
We just respond to being described as a conservative Jew, which doesn't offend me at all. To the contrary, I'm active in our Israel movement, and some of us have felt that we should really merge in Israel. We should have merged from the beginning for lots of reasons and the differences between our movements, even the ideology of our two movements, let alone how most members of our synagogues practice Judaism, did not justify two separate movements, certainly in Israel. And, with the pandemic and with the enormous change that it has and will introduce to the future of American Jewry and the pressures on the financials and so on, it wouldn't surprise me that even in North America, our two institutions, the Reform and Conservative central institutions will become ever closer, and who knows down the road. So it's not offensive to me at all to be considered within the realm of conservative thinking or conservative practice. That said, I do think it's important for me to emphasize I am a liberal. I have been a liberal since I first began studying liberalism seriously in university, where I spent 3 years in London, actually, studying with some of the great masters, legal masters and philosophical masters. And what do I mean by that? People have been struggling for centuries to define what constitutes a conservative, what constitutes a liberal. Rabbi Herman, you mentioned a few of the attributes of what constitutes a conservative: more respect for tradition, for precedent, and so on. That's why I said before, and I believe this. To my mind, it's more a question of temperament than of specific policies. If you track, for example, what constituted a liberal in the 60s and what constitutes a liberal today or a conservative, could George H.W. Bush, could he find a place in the modern Republican Party, or even George W. Bush? So that's not to get into a political argument. It's just simply to say, these positions, these political positions, change over time. So what in the end does constitute a liberal, from my perspective? It's more a question of temperament. It's more a question of what is characteristic of a liberal. Somebody who believes in change, who is more open to change than somebody who defines themselves as a conservative, is more open to rapid change, believes that not only you can change, but that your enemy can change. It's one reason, for example, that liberals in Israel were more open to the Palestinian peace accords, for example, than conservatives. And of course, there are certain basic fundamental principles that I think also conservatives believe: live and let live, freedom, liberty, and so forth. So when I say about myself, when I describe myself as a liberal, in particular in comparison to other people on the American map who describe themselves as a liberal, but they might be more progressive, they voice, both in terms of temperament and in terms of philosophical positions, positions that actually are illiberal. The idea that you would boycott or cancel, is an across the board. Of course, there are limits that all of us have, but that you would casually and so easily discredit somebody else it's not a liberal position. It's in fact illiberal. It's against the great classic liberal philosophy that really has been with us and has been articulated now for over a century or two. That's what I mean when I call myself a liberal.
I think it's actually, you remind me, it's an interesting story worth reflecting on. How Rabbi Ain said that we were all conservative Jews, and
let me clarify. That is not what I said. What I said was that the way we were talking about centrism is how many
That's how we define God.
Conservative Jews. I actually was not I just want to clarify. I was not trying to ascribe to either of you labels of a movement.
We're just aware that other people are listening in on this here.
But that's why I want the chance to clarify, lest I be accused.
That is appreciated, and it's actually, perhaps as much as we're focusing on the similarities that the three of us have, I think it's probably worth us reflecting on how we define. We're still using these denominational labels and what they mean to us. So you've already given us a good sense of what it means to be conservative. And Rabbi Hirsch reflected that sometimes when people can't see the difference, that there's perhaps a reason why don't we merge and come together, and spoke about potential mergers of reform in the conservative movement. And it reminded me actually in the 1920s, JTS and Yeshiva University almost merged because they had a common mission, which in the 1920s was to train English-speaking rabbis. That was at a time when the conservative movement was perhaps emphasizing more of its small c conservative values, that people didn't actually see as much of a distinction between that and what was happening in YU in the 1920s. And things shifted, and now it's the conservative reform movement where just even that suggestion even comes up. But perhaps it means what distinguished us in the 1800s, what distinguished us in the 1920s, because there's a reason we didn't merge. And what's distinguishing us now, we're still distinct, but maybe the distinctions are different. And it's perhaps really, I think maybe it could be valuable. This might be maybe a separate webcast to how we see these denominational labels that we inherited and yet still carry a lot of meaning to us and why they are important. But I do remember actually Rabbi Golinkin, was leading conservative rabbi in Israel, actually articulated, I have to look up some notes, 14 points that distinguishes the conservative movement from modern Orthodoxy, with leaving aside, Haredi Orthodoxy. And, many of them, it's interesting, out of his 14, some of them I think still, and this is very modern, resonated with me, which would be why I still identify as a modern Orthodox Jew, and some of them I think might not even hold as much, relevance as they did when he, first articulated them. But that's, I think maybe it could be a separate webcast. I think it's still be important, to explore. So I think, maybe just in closing for this, first session, next week is Rosh Hashanah. So, this again probably could be a whole session to itself. But what are you hoping for, in the coming year? In the context of, what kind of conversations, could we be having, next year? I don't mean just the three of us, but in our communities, our neighborhoods, and, what will, hope the next year would look like.
I think we need to do two things simultaneously. We need to do more than two things, but we need to do at least two things. We need to, and I'm doing this with my Jewish rabbi lens, thinking about being the rabbi of a synagogue. I think we need to understand how Judaism can respond and should respond to these central moments. How do we respond to health and spirituality and crisis and fear and resilience? What does our text, what does our tradition, what does our technology say? I think that's really a crucial question that we need to unpack. A lot of us made decisions in March, not knowing where we were going to be with regard to how to use technology, and we made decisions either to use or not use. Being in this for the longer haul, I really think it is a much deeper question of, can Judaism speak to human issues of the day? So that's one conversation I think we should be having, and we can only have that if we speak deeply about what is Judaism and do we understand what that means. The second question I think we need to grapple with is, what didn't I learn? And what do I need to learn? And I think this year, specifically in the area of racial justice, what information did we not even know that we didn't know? And I think that that is something that I have come to terms with over the last 5 months, be it gaps in my learning, in my history, gaps in how phrases are used. We need to be open to knowing that what we think is standard is not, and we need to force ourselves to go deeper. So those are the two of the areas that I'm thinking: be stronger Jews and how Judaism can and should speak to us, and know what we don't know, and then commit to learning more.
Rabbi Hirsch.
I would say, that's very well said, and that's right. I would add, the Jewish community is facing a very difficult year for individuals and for the establishment, the instrumentalities of American Jewry, and the country is facing a very difficult year. First, and obviously, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to speak about this next time, we are going to be living with this pandemic in all likelihood for the better part of at least the next year. that has imposed and will continue to impose enormous financial, emotional, individual hardship on people individually, but also on the Jewish community. I would like our Jewish institutions, without which there is no Judaism, to be healthy. I pray for each of our individuals, congregants, and all members of our community that may not get sick, that feel healthy physically, but also emotionally. I think the organized American Jewish community, which is, as I said, imperative to American Jewish identity, is going to have a very, very, very difficult year. Some institutions are not going to make it. And I hope and pray for the well-being of American Jewish institutions, the synagogue being at the center of American Jewry, without which we cannot sustain American Jewish life. And that is going to be, this year is going to be enormously damaging to health and well-being of American synagogue. The second thing I would say, hopefully we'll be able to elaborate on this in the future, is the country is facing a very, very consequential choice within the next 2 months. I hope and pray with all of the emotional, political, Jewish energy that I can, that the country will make the right choice. Because we are in severe crisis in this country. And if we make the wrong political choices, we not only will not begin to feel the problems will grow and they will be exacerbated.
Thank you both for those, really outstanding words of bracha, and I can't think of, any better thoughts, to which to begin the new year on. And I would only add just, 2 thoughts, in closing. I think, the first is, what's the story that we're going to tell? We've, had a lot of learning. There's a lot, as Rabbi Ain said, we don't know, we need to learn. But I think we have a story to tell. And what's going to be the Jewish story? What's the American story that we want to tell in this coming year? And that's the conversation. And with that story, the story should lead to transformation. It should be a transformation. The world itself, we speak about Tikkun Olam, but there's also a Tikkun Midot of how we improve ourselves. And I think maybe just in closing, reminded of the story of a Hasidic Rebbe who said that he started out his life trying to change the world. He realized that was too great an undertaking. He said, maybe I'll just change my country. That also was very difficult. So he said, I'll change my city. And then he says, okay, maybe I'll just change my neighborhood, my community. And in the end, he realized all he managed to change was himself. He said, perhaps if I began trying to change myself, then maybe with that I would have changed my community, then my country, perhaps through that, the entire world. So I think, it should be all of our bracha that we should be able to inspire each other, we'll learn from each other, but really with the hope that we all grow, and it's through our own personal growth that everything else falls into place and we make a better world results. So thank you for joining this first session. Thank you to our audience. And we hope to be back soon and wishing all of you a Shana Tova, a really